Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Iran, the suspect nuclear weapons program in Iran. The negotiations continue, non-transparency. We hope for the best, but we prepare for. Malcolm Hoenlein, Conference of Presidents, Major American Jewish Organizations, joins me. Malcolm, a very good evening to you.
Good evening, John.
I don't need to remind this audience that Iran is non-transparent and deceptive. Their past practices suggest that they're going to be very aggressive in this negotiation. So far, is that your information, that there's aggression going on?
And certainly moving in that direction.
We welcome Ambassador James F. Jeffrey. He is the Philip Solondz Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute. Mr. Ambassador Jim, a very good evening to you. The non-transparency of the negotiations since last November 23rd is a puzzle because both sides, all sides, everyone looking at this from the outside needs to trust this process if we're going to trust the conclusions. What do we know so far about these technical negotiations or even about the writing of the document? Do we believe that the P5+1 representatives and the Iran representatives are in agreement that a deal can be reached? Good evening to you.
Good evening back to you, John and Malcolm. I think there's a general assumption that an agreement is possible. What we hear from both sides is that they're surprised at the progress being made. That's not necessarily a good thing because it may be that we're not putting as much pressure on the Iranians as we should. At the end of the day, the Iranians are going to hold with some sort of enrichment, and the issue is how much and how many months will this buy us if there was ever a breakout. And then there are other issues that we've talked about before, weaponization, the missiles, which are not specifically part of the negotiations, but they're a great problem to us, and how you inspect and how you try to get more information on, as you said, a non-transparent regime.
In the beginning and in recent months, we heard reluctant statements about the process, and yet now we're hearing a very different tone with Wendy Sherman telling her people to pack for 2 months and expect to be negotiating every day until the July 20th deadline. What is your sense of where we are in this negotiation, and how do you interpret these statements in terms of the drive for America to get a deal?
Well, the president has said, and he's the decisive individual, there's about a 50% chance. That was some time ago after the initial agreement. The word from the negotiators is very positive, but we haven't seen the final, none of us have seen, but I don't think our negotiators have seen the final bottom line position of the Iranians. This is a position that will have to be sold to one or another degree to the U.S. Congress, to our other allies in the P5+1, and you saw how difficult France was, or not how tough France was back in November, and will have to be communicated and sold to one degree or another to Israel and our other allies and friends in the Middle East.
But do you get a sense that this is going to be any deal that we can get as long as we can wrap it in a way that sells? Or are we holding to the criteria that were set and just now putting on the pressure, noting that Rouhani has domestic pressure, Khamenei, because of the economy, because of the demands of the people?
At the end of the day, the situation we have now is, or the situation we had before the interim agreement was, the Iranians within X number of weeks or months, and it would have been only a few months, could have reached that red line that Bibi Netanyahu laid out in 2012 at the UN General Assembly. The hope is, and the expectation, and I'm pretty sure we will get this, will be to move that timeline to that red line back by a considerable period of time. By, first of all, we've already limited the enrichment to 5%. Secondly, by putting restrictions on the number of centrifuges they can use. How those restrictions will be, how many centrifuges they will still have, and how they will be observed will determine with what kind of credibility we can look at that period of time. It might be 6 months, it might be 8 months. We don't know how long that period of time will be.
Puzzle. Iran has, in the past, had a nuclear weapons program. Weaponization has been part of its process, and yet Iran continues right to this moment, to deny the obvious, the facts established by the inspectors. Therefore, Jim, help the audience understand, how do we trust a regime that's going to make a promise, given that we know that its promises are worthless in the past?
First of all, we don't trust them. This is not a question of trust, not with these guys. Secondly, on the weaponization, unlike the missiles, the weaponization is a specific part of the negotiations. It's a specific part of the UN Security Council issue and part of the IAEA. If we yield on that and let the Iranians say, we didn't weaponize, forget about it, we're not going to answer your questions, we're not going to let you into Pachun, where there's supposedly been new activity, then this is not a very good deal. Assuming we do get that, though, the question of how can we trust that they will live up to their commitments is we can't. We have to have, A, intrusive inspections, and secondly, a national means of intelligence, not only by us, but by many of our friends and allies, and that has to be backed up by a willingness to take automatic, firm action, like we did with the very tough sanctions in the last couple of years, if we find them violating.
But
without questions, without votes.
The president said that Iran cannot be allowed to have nuclear weapons. He made that his red line, not one that he's made pink yet. The Secretary of State says 6 to 12 months breakout. Susan Rice, visiting Israel, says it has to be at least a year. Any period of breakout. The anticipation, therefore, is that they're going to violate the deal, and the only question is, how many months will it take to do that? Doesn't that undermine any confidence in this deal?
No, I would say, in this regard, I'll leap to their defense. Not easy, but I can do this. Unless you get rid of all the centrifuges and are sure that they don't exist anywhere, there will always be a period of time that they could break out. It can be 6 months, it can be 12 months, it can be a year and a half. And it's not an assumption that they will break out. It's a question of the more time we have, then the more likely we will, A, spot it, and B, be able to react against it. The better that is, the less likely they will to break out of it, because we'll put them back in the same conundrum they're in now. A threat of military force combined with very tough oil sanctions. So that's the plan. Whether we can carry that out or not is a different question.
Jim, you mentioned Parchin. I'll just stay with that. It's a military site. There's no indication from Tehran that the IAEA or anyone else will ever be allowed permission, surprise, inspection, complete transparency, cameras at a military site in Iran. Unless there is something new that you can tell us. Has Iran ever indicated that it'll allow inspectors at their military sites?
They haven't, and that is one of the demands of the P5+1. It's also a demand of the IAEA, and if we yield on that, we are making a tremendous mistake.
Malcolm, that looks like the broken deal before we have to talk about a deal.
But that's what scares me about all of the discussion that we're hearing now. It's not questioning the intent. It's questioning what we are setting ourselves up for a situation which cannot yield what they called a good deal. So we're only negotiating on how bad a deal can emerge from this. And we saw today, Jim, that the Saudis announced that they have invited Zarif and that they're reaching out and saying we can negotiate with them. Isn't that an indication that they really believe these talks are going nowhere?
Zarif is the foreign minister of Iran. Please continue, Jim.
Well, one possibility is that the Saudis think that a deal is possible, and they want to see if there are other ways that they can do deals with the Iranians. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a good thing. And it could be very insignificant. The Saudis have done this in the past, and it's produced nothing. So we don't know.
Final question, Jim, just 20 seconds. Iran is no longer the headline story in world affairs. Ukraine is, the crisis, the new Cold War. Has that made it harder or easier to get an Iranian deal?
I think it has made it harder because Iran looks at Ukraine and they look at other areas, Syria, and they think America is not willing to go to war against us, and therefore we can push the envelope. I'm worried about how all of these things play on each other, and many other people are around the world, unfortunately.
Jim Jeffrey, James F. Jeffrey, is the Philip Salons Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Washington Institute. Malcolm Hoenlein, I'm John Batchelor.